Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into something so tidy, so quiet, and so aggressively well organized that it borders on suspicious. The Swiss Alps, where the cows wear bells louder than some car alarms, where the trains apologize to you if they're 90 seconds early, and where an entire nation has agreed, without ever discussing it out loud, that every single window box will have geraniums in it at all times. We're talking villages so picturesque they look photoshopped in real life, cheese treated with the reverence of a religious relic, and a mountain culture built on the strange, comforting belief that if you just plan carefully enough, nothing bad will ever happen to you again. Before we lace up our hiking boots, a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's destination. Your ideas genuinely shape where this channel wanders next, and this little corner of the internet only keeps growing because of thoughtful suggestions like yours. So, if these late-night journeys are helping you drift off, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this little channel find more sleepy travelers like you. Leave a comment telling me where you're tucked in tonight and what the clock reads on your end, since this little corner of the internet apparently never sleeps. And if you'd rather wander off with just your ears, the channel now lives on Spotify too, with the link waiting down in the description. Now, let the lights go low, let a soft hum of background noise settle over the room, and get yourself properly comfortable, because somewhere up in the mountains, a cowbell is gently clanking, and it is not going to stop, ever, and you're going to learn to love it. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how an entire country decided that punctuality was a personality trait? Could you survive a village where the woodpile outside your house is silently judged by every single neighbour who walks past it? Would you know what to do with 7 different kinds of cheese fondue etiquette, or which fork is for spearing bread, and which fork will get you quietly disowned? Could you keep a straight face while a grown adult blows into a wooden horn taller than a canoe? And could you learn to trust a train schedule so completely that you'd set your own heartbeat to it? And now, congratulations! You've just woken up in a small village tucked into a fold of the Alps, somewhere between a postcard and a fairy tale, where the air smells like pine, cow, and the faint promise of chocolate. Welcome to Switzerland. Try very hard not to be late for anything. You wake to silence, real silence, the kind that doesn't exist anywhere you've lived before, broken only by the occasional distant clank of a cowbell drifting down from a high pasture like a lazy wind chime with a job to do. Your chalet, wooden, sturdy, and stacked with firewood arranged with the precision of a Tetris champion, sits on a slope so green it looks recently repainted. Somewhere below, a church bell counts out the hour with the calm authority of a woman who has never once been asked to hurry up. You're cold, you're cozy, and you're already slightly worried you're going to disappoint someone with your firewood stacking technique. They told you Switzerland was beautiful. They did not mention that the beauty comes with homework. You start to notice it the moment you look past the first house to the second one, and then the third. Nothing here happened by accident. Every rooftop shares the same steep pitch, engineered over centuries to shed heavy snow before its weight becomes a genuine structural argument. The wooden balconies, carved and worn smooth by decades of hands, follow patterns specific to each valley, so that a trained eye could look at a balcony railing and tell you almost exactly which mountain pass you were standing near. You run your palm along a sun-warmed timber beam, and feel the tiny grooves left by an axe 200 years ago. The wood so dense with cold-grown rings it barely rots. It's the architectural equivalent of a strict dress code that's been quietly enforced since before anyone alive can remember. The kind of consistency that would make a homeowners association weep with joy and mild professional jealousy. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, a hinge groans open at what feels like a scheduled hour, and you begin to suspect that punctuality here isn't a virtue so much as a physical law, like gravity. Except gravity occasionally takes a day off. You wander further, past a woodpile so precisely stacked it looks vacuum sealed. Logs facing the same direction, split ends aligned like a filing cabinet. And you realize this isn't just tidiness. In a place where a hard winter can genuinely threaten your survival, a badly stacked woodpile is a warning sign. A visible symptom of a household that might not make it to March. Neighbours notice. Neighbours always notice. There is a reason villages this small, this remote, and this dependent on shared labour have survived centuries of brutal winters. Because everyone quietly agreed, generations ago, that showing up for each other wasn't optional. It was infrastructure. The shared irrigation channels, called swanen or bisses, depending which side of the language line you're standing on, still carry snowmelt down from the glaciers exactly as they did in the Middle Ages. Maintained by rotating village labour the same way your building assigns trash duty. Except missing your turn here could mean someone's crops fail. You start to understand that the postcard prettiness isn't the point. It's the byproduct. Behind every flower box and matching shutter is a community that figured out, the hard way, over hundreds of winters, that survival up here requires everyone pulling in the same direction, at the same angle, on the same schedule. It's less a village and more a very slow, very patient machine, built out of pine wood and stubbornness, that has been quietly running since long before anyone thought to put it on a postcard. And somewhere in that machine, you already suspect, is a system for judging your woodpile that you have not yet fully understood. And honestly, you're not sure you're ready to. Let's take a closer look at those flower boxes, because once you notice them, you cannot stop noticing them. Every single balcony rail, without exception, seems to be dripping with the same red geraniums, spilling over the wood in a cascade so uniform it looks coordinated by satellite. You lean in and catch the faint, slightly bitter, slightly peppery smell of the leaves. A smell that will follow you through every village you visit here, whether you want it to or not. It's tempting to assume this is just good taste, a whole nation independently discovering the same flower, the way everyone somehow ends up owning the same style of umbrella. But spend a few days here, and you realize it's closer to an unwritten civic contract. The floral equivalent of everyone agreeing to mow their lawn on the same day. Some villages have gone so far as to include flower box requirements in local building regulations, which means somewhere in a filing cabinet in a municipal office, there is an actual legal document specifying how your balcony ought to look in July. Imagine if your city council required a specific flower in every window. And then imagine that everyone simply complied, cheerfully, for decades, without a single passive-aggressive note left on anyone's door. That's the geranium economy in a nutshell. There's a reason the flowers are almost always red, too, beyond simple aesthetics. Red is the colour that photographs best against the dark wood of a chalet and the green of a summer pasture, which means, whether anyone admits it or not, these villages have been unconsciously branding themselves since long before tourism board consultants existed. You watch an elderly woman on a ladder, watering can in hand, tending to a box of flowers she has almost certainly tended every single summer for 40 years, topping off the soil with the same unhurried rhythm she probably uses to knead bread or fold laundry. It's not a chore to her. It's closer to a small, quiet act of hospitality extended to every stranger who happens to glance up at her balcony. There is something almost radical about a whole community agreeing, without ever really discussing it, that beauty is a form of shared responsibility, the same way the woodpile is, the same way the shovelled sidewalk in front of your house is come January. Let a flower box go brown and bare for a season, and you won't be shouted at. Nobody here shouts about anything. But you will notice a certain politeness in your neighbour's next greeting that feels suspiciously like disappointment wearing its Sunday best. So you keep the geraniums watered, mostly because it feels rude not to, and slowly, without quite meaning to, you become part of the very same quiet conspiracy that's been blooming on these balconies since long before you or your camera ever arrived. Let's step onto the platform, because it's time to test this famous obsession with the clock for yourself. You check your watch against the enormous station clock, the one with the distinctive red second hand that ticks with a slightly exaggerated, almost theatrical pause at the 12, a design so iconic it was eventually licensed and sold worldwide as a wristwatch in its own right, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this country takes the concept of a minute. You watch the platform fill with commuters who are not rushing, not anxious, not glancing repeatedly at their phones the way you might expect from people about to catch public transport. They simply stand, calmly, because they have never once been given a reason to worry. At 8:03 exactly, not 8:02, not 8:04, the train slides in, and the doors open with a soft pneumatic hiss that sounds almost apologetic for daring to make any noise at all. It's the transportation equivalent of a surgeon who has never once left a sponge inside a patient, a level of institutional competence so total it starts to feel faintly uncanny. Behind that single train's arrival sits a staggering feat of coordination. Trains, trams, cable cars, funiculars, and postal buses in the mountains are all timed to connect with each other down to the minute, so that a hiker descending from a remote alpine trail can step off a cable car and directly onto a waiting postal bus without so much as a coffee break in between. It's a system built the way you'd build a piece of fine watchmaking. Dozens of tiny moving parts, all interlocking, all utterly dependent on every other part doing its job exactly on schedule. Miss a connection elsewhere in the world, and it's a shrug, a wait, a mildly annoying hour on a bench. Miss one here, and you start quietly reviewing your own life choices, because the system so rarely fails that when it does, the fault almost certainly lies with you. Visitors from more relaxed transit cultures tend to describe the whole experience as either miraculous or vaguely accusatory, the punctuality landing less like convenience and more like a gentle, well-dressed judgment on every train you've ever personally made late. You start adjusting your own habits within days, arriving at platforms embarrassingly early just to be safe, just in case the universe decides today is the day it wants to make an example of you. And somewhere, deep in a control center, a dispatcher is quietly, calmly watching a dozen screens, making sure that this whole, delicate, decades-old ballet keeps dancing exactly on beat. Because in this country, being on time isn't merely good manners. It's practically a form of respect you owe to everyone else standing on the platform beside you. Let's follow the sound of those bells higher up the slope, because it's time to meet the cows properly. And these are not background scenery. They are practically local celebrities with their own annual awards ceremony. Each spring, as the snow finally retreats from the high pastures, the entire herd is dressed for the occasion. Flowers woven into wide ceremonial collars, ribbons in the village's traditional colours, and bells so large and ornate that the sound rolling down the mountainside during the Alpenaufzug procession is less a gentle clank and more a full bronze orchestra warming up. Villagers line the road exactly as they would for a hometown parade, waving, calling out names, because yes, these cows have names, sometimes passed down through generations of the same farming family, the way you might name a boat after your grandmother. The honour of wearing the largest bell and leading the procession goes to the cow that produced the most milk that season. A genuine, quietly contested achievement, the bovine equivalent of Employee of the Year, complete with the kind of swagger you'd expect from someone who knows exactly how well she performed on her last review. It's almost impossible not to laugh at the sheer pageantry of it. A 600-kilogram animal strutting down a mountain road under a floral crown, while an entire village applauds. And yet, underneath the spectacle sits something genuinely practical. Getting cattle safely up to summer pasture and back down again before the weather turns has been a matter of survival here for centuries, not just tradition for tradition's sake. The bells themselves, once you spend enough time near them, reveal a subtlety you didn't expect. Each one is cast slightly differently, tuned by ear rather than machine, and an experienced herder walking through thick fog can tell you exactly which cow is where purely by the particular pitch and rhythm drifting through the mist, a kind of acoustic fingerprint for livestock. It's not so different from recognizing a friend's footsteps on the stairs before you ever see their face, except this friend weighs as much as a small car and occasionally headbutts a fence post for fun. Come autumn, the whole spectacle reverses for the Alpezug. Cows paraded back down through the village streets to noisy, genuine affection, marking both the end of the grazing season and, unofficially, the start of the country's other great obsession, the cheese that all that fresh alpine grass was quietly destined to become. You find yourself, by day 3, standing at your window at odd hours, just listening to the bells drift down from somewhere in the fog, cataloguing tones you can't yet identify, and slowly realizing that you have, without any warning at all, become the kind of person who finds a cowbell genuinely soothing. Let's follow those cows a little further, quite literally, into the cellar where their milk ends up transformed into something the entire nation treats with the gravity of scripture. You step down stone stairs into a cool, dim cave, lined floor to ceiling with wheels of cheese stacked like enormous library volumes, each one labelled, dated, and weighing more than a newborn calf. The air smells earthy, sharp, faintly like a damp basement crossed with a very expensive restaurant, and somewhere in the back, a cellar master moves along the racks with the unhurried focus of a museum curator, turning each wheel by hand, brushing its rind with brine, checking it the way you might check on a sourdough starter you've been nursing for a decade. This isn't casual food production. Certain cheeses here are protected by regulations so specific they read almost like legal contracts, dictating the exact region a cheese must come from, the breed of cow that produced the milk, sometimes even the particular alpine grasses the cows were allowed to graze on that season. Try to sell something as Gruyere that wasn't made under these precise conditions, and you'll discover a level of national outrage usually reserved for actual crimes. It's the cheese equivalent of a strict appellation system, the kind wine regions use, except instead of grapes, it's a cow standing on a very specific patch of mountainside, eating a very specific patch of grass. And somehow, everyone involved takes this deadly seriously. You'd think a food this beloved would be eaten casually, and mostly it is, except at the fondue table, where an entire etiquette quietly kicks in the moment the pot starts bubbling. Bread is speared onto a long fork, swirled through the melted cheese in a figure 8 to keep it from separating, and heaven help you if your cube slips off the fork and vanishes into the pot, because tradition insists this comes with a penalty. Sometimes a round of drinks for the whole table. Sometimes, depending who you ask, a kiss for your nearest neighbour. A rule that has almost certainly engineered more accidental romances over the centuries than any dating app could dream of matching. You watch a family work through their shared pot, with the calm, practiced choreography of people who have done this every week of their lives. Nobody double-dipping, nobody hogging the good melty bits near the rim. An entire micro-society of manners built around one shared vessel of cheese. It's communal eating at its most literal. A pot in the middle of the table standing in for trust, patience, and, apparently, a small ongoing referendum on your relationship status. Let's step out of the cheese cellar and into a shop window glowing warm and golden with row after row of chocolate bars. Because it would be a genuine offence to leave this country without addressing its other great culinary devotion. You press your nose almost to the glass and catch that rich, slightly caramelized smell, the kind that seems to physically slow your heart rate down a notch, and you start to understand why this small alpine nation somehow became synonymous with chocolate, despite growing exactly 0 cacao beans of its own. The transformation happened here through obsessive refinement rather than raw ingredients, a technique called conching. Essentially, a very long, very patient grinding and aerating process that turned what used to be a gritty, slightly bitter substance into the smooth, glossy, melt immediately on your tongue treat the whole world now associates with this country. Entire towns built their local economy around chocolate production, the same way mountain villages built theirs around cheese. Workers and machinery devoted with total seriousness to something the rest of the world still, somewhat unfairly, files under just dessert. The commitment to it borders on devotional. Per person, the population here eats through more chocolate annually than almost anywhere else on the planet, treating it less like an indulgence and more like a fundamental nutritional pillar, filed somewhere confidently between vegetables and bread. Walk into any shop, even a small village one that otherwise looks like it sells mostly postcards and hiking socks, and you'll find chocolate displayed with the reverence usually reserved for fine jewellery, each bar individually wrapped, labelled with the precision of a wine label, priced as though it might appreciate in value the longer it sits on the shelf, which, let's be honest, it absolutely will not, because nobody here, not one single person in the history of this country, has ever successfully left a bar of chocolate unopened for longer than a single afternoon. You buy one anyway. Tell yourself you'll save half for later, and within 20 minutes, find yourself standing on a quiet street corner, wrapper crumpled in your pocket, chocolate long gone, staring out at the mountains with the specific, slightly guilty satisfaction of someone who has just been thoroughly, willingly defeated by a 4-franc bar of dessert. It's a small, sweet reminder that for all the precision and discipline this country prides itself on, it has also quietly perfected the art of surrender, at least when chocolate is involved. Let's lift your eyes now, away from the shop windows, up toward the peaks that have been watching over every single one of these villages the entire time. Because it's finally time to talk about the mountains themselves. Stand in almost any valley here, and the Alps don't simply frame the view, they dominate it completely. Jagged walls of grey stone and white snow rising so abruptly from the valley floor that your neck genuinely aches from looking up at them. The air at this altitude has a thin, clean bite to it, cold enough to sting your lungs pleasantly on the first deep breath, carrying a faint mineral smell off the rock that no amount of scented candle back home has ever quite managed to replicate. For centuries, life here wasn't built despite these mountains. It was built entirely around negotiating with them. An ongoing, patient conversation between people and terrain that never really ends. Farmers learn to work slopes so steep that elsewhere they'd be considered unusable, terracing fields by hand, moving cattle with the seasons between low winter barns and high summer pastures, in a rhythm called transhumance that is repeated, largely unchanged, for well over 1,000 years. Houses were positioned with an almost superstitious care, angled just so against prevailing winds and known snow paths. Because a badly placed chalet here isn't merely poor design, it's a genuine hazard waiting for the wrong winter. And these same peaks that made daily life so demanding also handed this small country an accidental strategic advantage that shaped its entire history. The high mountain passes cutting through the Alps were for centuries some of the only reliable routes linking northern and southern Europe, meaning merchants, pilgrims, and armies alike were forced to funnel through these narrow valleys, whether they wanted to or not. This small alpine nation found itself sitting, almost by geographic accident, at one of the continent's most important crossroads, a position that brought trade, brought influence, and brought exactly the kind of unwanted foreign attention that eventually convinced this country to become fiercely, famously protective of staying out of everyone else's business. It's the geopolitical version of living at the one intersection every driver in town has to pass through, and slowly realizing you'd rather direct traffic quietly than get run over by it. You stand at the edge of a valley, watching cloud shadows drag slowly across a rock face that has outlasted every single human plan ever made in its shadow. And you start to understand that everything else you've seen here, the cheese, the trains, the flower boxes, is really just a very charming set of adaptations to one enormous, indifferent, breathtaking fact of geography. Let's talk about the mountain's temper for a moment, because up here, that beauty comes with a very real, very carefully managed danger that shapes almost every decision made above the tree line. You notice it first in small details. A sturdy wedge-shaped stone wall built into a slope above a cluster of houses, oddly deliberate for something that just looks like landscaping, until you learn it was placed there generations ago, specifically to split an incoming avalanche in two, sending it harmlessly around the village rather than through it. A bit like a duck blind, except instead of ducks, it's several tons of snow moving at terrifying speed, and instead of missing you by luck, it misses you by design. Traditional building placement across these valleys follows knowledge passed down through generations of hard, sometimes tragic, experience. Families who learned exactly which slopes released snow in a bad year and which didn't, and built their homes accordingly. An inherited map of danger drawn not on paper, but in where the chalets happen to sit. Modern avalanche management layers genuine science on top of that old instinct. Forecasters tracking snowpack stability the way meteorologists track storm systems. Teams using controlled explosive charges to deliberately trigger smaller, manageable slides before the snow can build into something catastrophic. Essentially performing minor scheduled disasters to prevent major unscheduled ones. And then there are the dogs. Specially trained avalanche rescue dogs who can locate a buried person by scent alone, faster than almost any piece of equipment humans have built. Noses working through feet of packed snow with a speed and accuracy that still occasionally outperforms the machines invented to replace them. It's the kind of danger that never fully disappears, only gets respected, monitored, and managed. Not unlike living next door to a large, generally pleasant relative who occasionally, without warning, loses their temper in a way that requires the whole neighborhood to have a plan. Ski patrols check reports each morning the way you'd check the news. Locals develop an intuitive read of the snow simply from a lifetime of living beneath it, glancing up at a loaded slope with the same casual, practiced awareness you might use crossing a busy street back home. You find yourself, after a few days here, doing the same thing without quite meaning to. Eyeing a particularly steep, snow-heavy face above a trail, and feeling a small, previously unfamiliar instinct kick in. A tiny inherited caution, borrowed from centuries of people who learned, often the hard way, exactly how much respect these mountains are owed. Let's follow a low, mournful sound drifting across the valley, because it's time to meet one of the strangest and most wonderful instruments you'll ever see a grown adult wrestle into position. The alphorn stretches up to 12 feet long, carved traditionally from a single piece of spruce that grew naturally bent under the weight of mountain snow, which means the instrument itself is essentially a tree that spent its whole life training for this exact job. Watching someone play one is a genuine spectacle. The player bracing the enormous curved horn against a wooden stand or a helpfully sturdy shoulder, cheeks puffed, drawing in a breath that seems to last an entire geological era, before releasing a note so low and resonant it seems to vibrate directly in your sternum rather than your ears. It sounds less like conventional music and more like the mountain itself, clearing its throat to say something important. Originally, this wasn't performance at all. It was pure long-distance communication, a way to call cattle in from pasture, signal the start of milking, or let the next valley over know that dinner, or trouble, or news was on its way. All without the benefit of a single telephone wire. The sound can genuinely carry for miles across still alpine air. A natural megaphone built centuries before anyone had electricity to compete with it. Alongside the Alp horn, you'll almost certainly hear yodeling, a vocal technique built on exactly the same communication problem, rapidly flipping between a low chest voice and a much higher register in a way that, for reasons of pure acoustics, travels extraordinarily far across open valleys. To an untrained ear, it sounds a bit like someone attempting an aria while being gently bounced on a trampoline, all sudden octave leaps and cheerful yips. And yet, to the people who grew up with it, this is simply how you say hello to a neighbour 3 ridgelines away. What's remarkable is how practical both traditions actually were, born from genuine necessity in a landscape where distance and terrain made ordinary shouting completely useless, long before either one became the cheerful, feathered hat postcard image most outsiders associate with them today. You watch a local alphorn ensemble rehearse in a village square, a semicircle of enormous wooden horns angled skyward, like some kind of gentle, brass-free artillery, and by the third note you find your shoulders have genuinely relaxed, because it turns out there is something deeply, unexpectedly soothing about being on the receiving end of a message that was originally designed. Let's turn your wrist over for a moment, because it's time to talk about the small mechanical marvels ticking away on half the arms in this country. You lean closer to a shop window in the village centre and see dozens of them lined up under soft lighting, each face engineered with the same obsessive precision you've been noticing in the train timetables and the wood piles, as if punctuality here isn't just a cultural trait, but something people have physically strapped to their bodies just to be safe. This tradition didn't start in a factory. It started in farmhouses during the long, dark winter months when the fields were frozen solid and useless, and skilled hands that had spent summer tending cows and hay suddenly found themselves with nothing but time and a very steady grip. Entire alpine valleys turned to intricate, tiny mechanical work, assembling gears smaller than a grain of rice, with nothing but tweezers, patience, and eyesight that would make a modern optometrist weep. You pick up a loop in one workshop and peer through it at a movement so small it looks like a miniature city. Dozens of interlocking parts, each doing one job, endlessly, for decades, without complaint, which is either the most romantic or the most exhausting way to describe a watch you've ever heard. Over generations, individual villages and valleys became known for supplying specific components, one specializing in springs, another in casings, another in the tiny jeweled bearings that keep everything from wearing itself out. A supply chain built centuries before anyone used that phrase, stitched together not by corporate headquarters, but by mountain roads and mule trains. The reputation for accuracy that grew out of these workshops eventually became something close to the country's entire personality. Exported to the rest of the world, one wristwatch at a time, until owning one felt less like buying a timepiece and more like being handed a small, formal guarantee that yes, this obsession with precision really is as serious as the postcards suggest. You watch a watchmaker at a bench, bent over a piece no larger than a coin, adjusting something with a screwdriver thinner than an eyelash. And you start to understand that this isn't just a craft. It's closer to a form of patience treated as a competitive sport. It's the horological equivalent of a country introducing itself by handing you a business card that also happens to be a perfectly calibrated machine. And somehow, after everything else you've seen here, that doesn't feel like an exaggeration at all. It feels like an understatement. Let's step off the workshop floor and into a different kind of precision altogether, the kind measured in numbers rather than gears. You notice it in the quiet, understated buildings tucked along certain streets. No flashing signs, no aggressive marketing, just heavy doors, discreet nameplates, and an atmosphere that suggests everyone inside is thinking very carefully before saying anything out loud. For centuries, banks here built an international reputation around exactly that kind of discretion. A country politically stable, militarily neutral, and fiercely protective of financial privacy, which made it an appealing place for wealth from all over the world to quietly, calmly settle in. The way a nervous traveller might choose the calmest room in the house to leave their valuables. That reputation for secrecy has loosened considerably over recent decades, worn down by international pressure and new transparency agreements that opened records once considered practically untouchable. A shift that made headlines around the world and forced an entire industry to rewrite its own rulebook. But the broader instinct behind it, the deep cultural comfort with caution, thrift, and long-term planning, never really left. It just stopped living exclusively behind bank doors and spread quietly into ordinary daily life instead. You see it in how villages manage shared resources, in how households budget with a kind of methodical care that would make a spreadsheet blush, in how even casual conversations about spending carry a faint undertone of quiet, responsible worry, as if everyone has collectively agreed that money is best handled the way you'd handle a very old, very expensive watch. Carefully, patiently, and never in front of strangers. It's a nation that seems to have decided, generations ago, that the responsible thing to do with money is worry about it constantly and mention it rarely, which might be the single most Swiss sentence you could possibly construct. You watch a shopkeeper carefully count out change to the exact centime, no rounding, no shrugging it off, and you realize this same instinct for precision that built the watch industry and the train schedule has simply been quietly running the ledgers here as well, one careful, unhurried column at a time, for a very, very long time. Let's step back out into the open air, because it's time to talk about something that shapes daily life here far more than a concept this quiet has any right to. This country has maintained a policy of armed neutrality for centuries, deliberately staying out of the wars that repeatedly tore through its neighbours, even as those same neighbours marched armies back and forth across the continent within sight of these very mountains. And yet, almost every able-bodied man here is required to serve in a militia army and, until relatively recently, keep a government-issued rifle at home. A curious, almost contradictory national personality, staunchly pacifist on the world stage,
while quietly maintaining a small arsenal in the family basement, just in case. It's not laziness, and it's certainly not indifference. It's an entire deliberate strategy built on mountain geography that makes any invasion a genuine logistical nightmare, on careful, unshowy diplomacy that avoids picking sides, and on hosting international organizations that specifically need a stable, impartial host willing to stay quietly out of everyone's business. You notice the effects of it everywhere once you start looking. The calm confidence of a country that has simply never had to rebuild itself after a war, buildings standing untouched for centuries, records unbroken, traditions uninterrupted, a continuity that much of the rest of the continent, understandably, cannot claim. It's the geopolitical equivalent of that one calm co-worker who refuses to get pulled into any office drama, who somehow never takes sides in the group chat, and who, purely by staying out of every argument, ends up being the one person everyone trusts to hold the shared petty cash box.
You watch a group of local reservists board a train with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, chatting about lunch plans with the same relaxed energy you'd expect from people carrying tennis rackets. And you realize this contradiction, quietly armed, resolutely peaceful, isn't a flaw in the national character at all. It's the entire point. A country that decided, centuries ago, the safest position in Europe was the one where nobody had any particular reason to bother you. Let's talk about how decisions actually get made here, because this is a country that takes the idea of asking the people rather seriously. More seriously, in fact, than almost anywhere else on Earth. Citizens vote not just occasionally for a representative, but frequently, sometimes several times a year, on specific, detailed policy questions put directly to the public rather than filtered entirely through elected officials. Enough signatures on a petition, and a new law can be challenged and put straight to a nationwide vote. Enough signatures on a different kind of petition, and citizens can propose an entirely new addition to the Constitution themselves. No career politician required. It's democracy, with the training wheels removed. Every voter expected to actually read the accompanying government pamphlet, explaining both sides of a fairly technical infrastructure question, form a genuine, considered opinion, and show up to cast a ballot on it. Which perhaps explains why this culture's fussy, detail-oriented attention to civic life runs so deep. You picture trying to explain this system to someone back home. The idea that, instead of just grumbling about a new zoning law at a dinner party, you'd actually be expected to vote on it by name, in detail, multiple times annually. And you start to understand why an entire population here seems to walk around with the quiet, slightly weary confidence of people who take their responsibilities extremely seriously. It's a bit like being handed shared custody of an enormous, complicated garden, and being told that everyone, not just the appointed gardener, is expected to show up regularly with an opinion about the hedges. You watch a stack of referendum pamphlets sitting on a cafe table, dense with policy detail that would make most people's eyes glaze over within a paragraph, and notice the elderly man beside you reading through it with the same careful, unhurried attention he probably gives his morning newspaper. because here, that pamphlet effectively is the newspaper, just with slightly higher stakes. It either produces an unusually engaged, informed citizenry or an unusually tired one. And having watched this country in action for a few days now, you're fairly convinced it's produced a healthy, functioning dose of both. Let's cross a line on the map now, because it's time to talk about a border you can genuinely hear before you can see it. This country doesn't have one official language, it has four: German, French, Italian, and Romansh, each tied to its own region, each carrying its own cuisine, its own dialect, its own particular way of pronouncing the word for cheese, all packed into a country roughly the size of a mid-sized American state. Drive from a German-speaking canton into a French-speaking one, and the shop signs change as cleanly as if someone had drawn a line with a ruler. Which, in a way, someone did, centuries ago, and everyone since has simply agreed to respect it. You stop for coffee on one side of that invisible line and order in careful, textbook German, then drive 20 minutes further and find yourself fumbling through French instead. The menu, the radio, even the rhythm of casual small talk shifting entirely, as if you'd crossed into an entirely different country without ever showing a passport. This linguistic patchwork means a single small nation contains an enormous range of regional personality. The precise, orderly reputation most outsiders associate with the German-speaking regions giving way, just a mountain pass later, to the more relaxed, café culture pace of the French-speaking West, and further south still, to the sun-warmed, espresso-fueled energy of the Italian-speaking valleys, with tiny, fiercely protected pockets of Romansh holding on in the remotest corners, spoken by a small population determined not to let it quietly disappear. It's a bit like four very different, very set-in-their-ways relatives sharing one impeccably tidy house, each insisting on their own corner of the pantry, their own preferred radio station, and their own very firm opinion about how the fondue ought to be seasoned. You sit in a train carriage and listen to the announcements cycle politely through multiple languages, one after another. The same simple message about the next station repeated with total patience each time. And you realise this constant, practiced switching isn't treated as an inconvenience here at all. It's just the ordinary, expected texture of daily conversation. A country that decided long ago that speaking someone else's language back to them wasn't a burden, it was simply good manners. Let's climb up above the villages now, past the tree line, because tucked along these high trails sit small stone refuges that have sheltered hikers, herders, and climbers for well over a century. And they run on a system that feels almost impossibly trusting for anywhere else in the world. You push open a heavy wooden door and step into a simple, low-ceilinged room, a wood stove crackling in the corner, shelves stocked with tea, soup, bread, and a bit of cheese, and a logbook sitting open on the table, waiting for your name. There's often no one else here, no cashier, no check-in desk, just a handwritten price list and a small wooden box for payment. An honesty system so complete it would collapse instantly anywhere less patient than this. Exhausted hikers arrive, sign in, cook themselves a simple meal from supplies a hut warden might only restock once a week by helicopter or mule train, and leave their payment based purely on what they used, trusting entirely that the next weary traveller through that door will do exactly the same. It's a small, functioning pocket of pure trust, perched at genuinely inconvenient altitude, the kind of system that would need armed guards practically anywhere else, running instead on nothing but a shared, quiet agreement to be decent to strangers you'll likely never meet. You settle onto a narrow wooden bunk that night, blankets heavy and slightly scratchy, the wind rattling faintly against the shutters outside, and you find yourself oddly moved by the whole arrangement, less by the mountain view, spectacular as it is, and more by the simple fact that an entire chain of huts across an entire mountain range has been quietly running for generations, purely because enough people, one after another, kept their word. It's the kind of system that sounds almost naive when you first describe it out loud, and yet here it's simply Tuesday, a small stone room at 8,000 feet where the strongest lock on the door is everybody's shared understanding that this only works if nobody ruins it. Let's lace up properly now, because hiking here isn't a casual weekend hobby, it's closer to a national pastime, pursued with the seriousness of a competitive sport. An extraordinarily well-maintained network of trails threads across the entire country, marked with cheerful yellow signposts that don't bother giving you a distance in kilometres, because apparently that would be far too vague and unhelpful, and instead give you an exact walking time to the next village, calculated with the same unwavering confidence as the train schedule you've already come to trust with your life. You stand at a junction, studying one of these signs. Zermatt, 2 hours 15 minutes, and feel a small, absurd wave of reassurance. The same reassurance you'd feel checking a departure board, because apparently, even your leisurely mountain stroll deserves a properly engineered timetable. The trail itself winds past working farms, cows grazing placidly a few feet from the path, past that same network of centuries-old irrigation channels still quietly carrying snowmelt downhill, past small wooden shrines tucked into rock faces, weathered by generations of hikers pausing briefly to catch their breath and, occasionally, say a quiet word of thanks for not slipping. The air smells of crushed pine needles and wildflowers, thin and sharp in your lungs at altitude. And somewhere below, a cowbell clanks its familiar, unhurried rhythm, following you the entire way like a slow, patient soundtrack. You pass other hikers, some clearly serious mountaineers with poles and gear, others in what looks suspiciously like their Sunday church clothes, and every single one offers the same brief, polite greeting as you cross paths. A small ritual of trail courtesy that feels as deeply embedded as the flower boxes back in the village. By the time you reach the next sign confirming, almost smugly, that yes, It did in fact take exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes. You start to understand that this isn't simply about getting from one point to another. It's about proving, one carefully signposted trail at a time, that even leisure here runs on the same quiet, stubborn precision as everything else. Let's fast forward through the seasons for a moment, because when the snow finally arrives, these same quiet farming villages transform almost overnight into some of the most famous playgrounds on Earth. The chalets that spent all summer surrounded by grazing cows and hanging geraniums are suddenly ringed by chairlifts and cable cars. The wooden barns repurposed as ski rental shops, and an entire local economy pivots, cheerfully and without missing a beat, from cheese and cows to lift passes and mulled wine. Some of the earliest ski resorts and mountain cable car systems anywhere in the world were built directly into these slopes, engineering marvels for their time that turned remote, isolated farming communities into genuine international destinations, drawing visitors from across the globe, eager to carve down the same mountainsides local children learned to ski on almost before they could properly walk. You watch a group of 5-year-olds in tiny, brightly coloured ski suits shuffle confidently past you toward the beginner lift, utterly unbothered by a slope that would make most adult tourists reconsider their life choices. And you start to understand that skiing here isn't a hobby picked up on holiday. It's practically a second native language, taught as early and as thoroughly as the actual one. The lift lines move with the same calm efficiency as the trains, tickets scanned in an instant, cable cars departing on schedule regardless of how full they are, because naturally, even getting up a mountain for fun deserves proper timekeeping. Along the slopes, mountain restaurants serve rösti and hot cheese dishes to skiers still in full gear, boots clomping across wooden decks, sunburned faces glowing with the specific, smug satisfaction of people who've just spent the morning falling down a mountain and are extremely pleased about it. What's remarkable is how completely this seasonal transformation manages to happen without erasing what made these villages charming in the first place. The wooden chalets, the church bells, the same red geraniums somehow persisting even under a fresh layer of snow. It's less a switch flipped between two identities, and more a single village learning generations ago to wear two very different, equally well-tailored outfits, depending entirely on which way the thermometer is leaning. Let's settle by the fire for a moment, because it's time to talk about a fictional little girl who somehow became one of the most effective tourism ambassadors in modern history without ever actually existing. The story, about a young orphan sent to live with her gruff grandfather high in the mountains, surrounded by goats, fresh air and simple wooden huts, was written as a gentle children's tale, and yet it managed to shape how much of the entire world still pictures alpine life today, decades and multiple film adaptations later. You mention the name in almost any village here, and get a knowing, slightly weary smile. The kind of expression you'd expect from someone whose hometown got permanently typecast by a single very popular movie. The real mountain life the story loosely drew from was, predictably, considerably harder than the storybook version, full of genuine physical labour, real isolation through brutal winters, and children who worked alongside their families from an early age, rather than skipping cheerfully through wildflower meadows all afternoon. And yet, the romanticised image proved so appealing, so exportable, that it became almost inseparable from the country's own image of itself, an entire tourism identity quietly built, brick by brick, chalet by chalet, goat by goat, around a story nobody here actually asked to be associated with, but that turned out to be remarkably good, free advertising. You visit a small farm, advertised as a genuine alpine dairy experience, and notice, tucked discreetly among the actual cheese-making equipment, a small illustrated sign referencing the very same story. Because if millions of visitors are going to arrive already primed to expect goats and gruff grandfathers, you might as well have both ready and waiting. It's the kind of accidental branding most companies spend decades and enormous marketing budgets chasing, and this country got it handed to them, free of charge, by a children's book published well over a century ago, which either makes it the luckiest tourism story in Europe or proof that a good enough story, true or not, will always find a way to become the version people actually want to believe. Let's talk about the story locals tell their own children long before any tourist ever asks about it. Because no journey through this country's folklore is complete without the tale of the marksman forced to shoot an apple clean off his own son's head as punishment for refusing to bow to a tyrannical official's hat, mounted deliberately on a pole in the village square as a test of loyalty. Whether or not the story is historically accurate remains genuinely, openly debated by historians here, a fact everyone seems remarkably relaxed about, shrugging off the uncertainty the same easy way you might shrug off not knowing exactly who invented your favourite family recipe. What matters far more than the historical fine print is what the story became. A foundational symbol of independence and quiet, stubborn resistance to oppression, celebrated in local festivals, referenced in place names, printed on everything from postage stamps to chocolate wrappers, cemented so deeply into national identity that questioning its literal truth almost feels beside the point. Like arguing about whether your country's founding toast was truly delivered word for word as everyone claims. You stand in a town square where a statue commemorates the legend, watching tourists photograph it with the same casual reverence they'd give any famous landmark. And you realise this isn't really a history lesson at all. It's closer to a founding myth, the kind of story every country seems to eventually need. One dramatic, unforgettable image standing in gracefully for centuries of far messier, far less photogenic political reality. It's the narrative equivalent of a highlight reel, skipping past all the complicated negotiations and slow-moving treaties in favour of one perfect, tension-filled shot. And honestly, given the alternative, you can't really blame them for choosing the apple. Let's step into a village square transformed for winter, because these markets take an already impossibly charming main street and somehow make it look almost unfairly picturesque. Wooden stalls strung with warm lights,
snow gently dusting the chalet roofs above, the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine curling through the cold air in a combination that feels engineered specifically to be nostalgic for a childhood you may not have even personally had. You wrap both hands around a steaming mug, the spiced wine warming your fingers before it ever reaches your throat, and wander past stalls selling hand-carved wooden ornaments, thick woolen scarves, and small wheels of local cheese wrapped like gifts. Vendors calling out greetings in whichever of the 4 national languages happens to match your face. These markets carry on much older midwinter traditions, born from very practical need rather than pure aesthetics. Communities gathering together in the coldest, darkest stretch of the year specifically to share food, warmth, and simple company before the long final push through winter. It's a bit like your own instinct to host one last cozy gathering before everyone hunkers down for the season. Except here, it's been refined, generation after generation, into an entire festive economy of chestnuts and candlelight. Children skate on a small rink set up in the village centre, laughing and stumbling in a way that suggests this particular rink has hosted every single winter of their lives so far, while their parents linger nearby with their own steaming mugs, watching with the relaxed, unhurried patience of people who know exactly how this evening will end and are perfectly happy about it. You notice, even here, amid the twinkling lights and cheerful chaos, a certain quiet order to things. Stalls arranged in a sensible, easy-to-navigate loop. Crowds moving with an almost choreographed courtesy. Nobody shoving toward the mulled wine stand the way you might expect at a market back home. It's festive, but it's tidy festive, joyful, but on a schedule. Proof that even at its most relaxed and twinkling, this country simply cannot quite bring itself to let go of its love for things done properly. Let's end where the whole day quietly began, in the silence, because it's worth pausing here for a moment before we drift off entirely. In many of these villages, quiet isn't just something that happens to occur, it's something actively, deliberately protected, sometimes even written into local ordinance. Sundays especially carry a kind of unspoken hush, loud yard work set aside, laundry left unwashed, lawnmowers left silent in the shed, an entire community agreeing, without much discussion, that this one day belongs to rest rather than noise. You notice it first as an absence. No distant hum of machinery, no car doors slamming, no music drifting from an open window, just the occasional creak of a shutter, a church bell counting out the hour with its usual calm authority, and somewhere far off, that same familiar cowbell clanking along at its own unhurried pace. It feels almost radical, the idea that an entire community would collectively decide silence is worth protecting, the same way they protect their flower boxes or their wood piles, treating stillness itself as a shared resource, rather than simply the absence of something more interesting.
You sit on a wooden bench outside your chalet as the light fades gold and then blue over the peaks. And you realize this quiet isn't empty at all. It's full of small sounds you'd never normally notice. Wind moving through pine branches, A distant trickle of snowmelt in one of those centuries-old irrigation channels. The soft clink of dishes being washed 2 houses down. It's the acoustic equivalent of the whole village finally exhaling after a long, precisely managed week. And you find your own shoulders dropping slightly in sympathy, the same way they did the first time you heard an alphorn note roll across the valley. There is something worth carrying home in that. Long after you've left these mountains behind, the small, deliberate reminder that rest doesn't have to be an accident squeezed in between obligations. It can be built, planned, and protected on purpose. The same careful way everything else here seems to be. And so, as the last light drains from the peaks and the village settles fully into its evening hush, you understand, finally, that the quiet isn't the absence of all that Swiss precision you've been marvelling at all day. It's simply precision's final, gentlest project. The one thing this entire, careful, punctual, cowbell-loving country has agreed, without a single vote required, to protect above everything else. So here you are, at the end of a long, unhurried day spent among cheese sellers and cable cars, watchmakers and wood piles, geraniums that somehow bloom on schedule, and trains that never once let you down. You've watched cows parade through village streets in floral crowns, learned that a wooden horn 12 feet long can somehow feel more soothing than alarming, and discovered that an entire nation quietly agreed centuries ago that the responsible way to live is carefully, patiently, and just a little bit stubbornly. None of it happened by accident. Every postcard perfect village you wandered through today was built, slope by slope, generation by generation, out of hard winters, careful cooperation, and a shared understanding that showing up for your neighbours, whether that meant stacking your wood pile properly or simply keeping your flower boxes watered, was never really optional. It's a small country that turned precision into comfort and discipline into something that somehow, against all odds, still manages to feel warm. Whether or not you ever get to stand on that platform yourself and watch a train glide in at the very second it promised to, there's something worth carrying with you from these mountains tonight. The quiet, steady reminder that things done slowly and properly tend to last. Whether that's a cheese aging in a cellar, a trail worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps, or a village that simply decided long ago to look after itself, one red geranium at a time. So as you settle now into your own bed, in your own quiet room, let the last sound in your mind be that same distant bell, drifting down from some high, unseen pasture, unhurried, unbothered, entirely at peace with exactly where it is. wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, may your own little corner of the world feel, just for these next few minutes, as calm and as cared for as a Swiss village on a quiet Sunday evening. Sleep well. The mountains, as they always have, will keep the time